The Crosstracks platform appeals to a large audience of private investigators across the country and, in fact, across the world. One of the ways that we are able to appeal to such a broad audience is the controls that are inside of the system. One of those controls is the Roles and Access module, which allows you to create certain parameters and permissions for different types of users. In this video, we want to go over the investigator's roles and access. And this gives you the ability to create certain permission levels for different type of investigative users. Click on Settings in the left navigation bar and then locate the Users and Security section here on the right-hand side. The last item down is Roles and Access. In a previous video, we've covered the admin role. Now we're going to focus on the investigator role. If you have different types of investigators or multiple investigators in your organization, you can set different parameters, as I mentioned, for different types of users. For example, if you have an intern that just started with you and you don't want them to be able to delete or edit information, you could create a role, call it intern, and then set those permissions for that particular user. Then, once you create a new employee or a new investigator, you can assign them these roles inside of their profile. So you could call one an in-house investigator, you could give a subcontractor a different permission. For example, a lot of company owners don't want their subcontractors to be able to identify or see client information. You can certainly do that. So once you have a role created, you can do three things. You can edit the role name. You could go over here and say, I want to call this Investigator 1 or Investigator 2. You can go in the middle icon and click Manage Access, and we're going to do that here in a second. The third option you have is to delete a role. If you want to delete a role, be sure to remove that role from any active users prior to deleting it. I'm going to click on Manage Access for this default investigator. That's going to bring us to the Investigator Access screen where you control the permissions. The first thing we want to look at is the module rights. So this section provides you an explanation of what the access levels are. We're going to go back to those here in a second. So here in the permissions, you have case management. You have three columns. The module, that advises you which section of the system these permissions refer to. For example, this one refers to email capability. This one goes into case notes. This one sets permissions on what investigators are allowed to do with video files, report entries, and time tracker. The middle section here is the access of, and we're going to go over some of those items and explain that as well. The third column here is the access, and that's what these rights above here refer to. We have a solutions article in our knowledge base that covers this. I'm going to switch over to that real quick so we can get a visual of what we're talking about here. So in the access of, what does that refer to? That's these items here in this middle column. So what is access of? If you change the permission to own, that particular user can only access items that they created or that belong to them. If you change it to the admin, that user can access items that are created by an administrative user or items belonging to an administrative user. With the investigator access, they're able to access items created by any investigator or items that belong to any investigator. If you give them the client access of, that user can then see items that a client could see. If you want to give them full access, you can do that as well. Now, the access level over here, what are we giving them access to? In this situation, we would give the investigator full access to everything that they create or that are associated with them in billing and expenses. Let's go back over to our article here. What does the access provide an investigator? What do these settings refer to? If you give them view access, it allows them to only view information. If you give them create only, it does just that. They can only create. They can't update or delete. Modify allows them to edit information, but they cannot delete. If you want to give them delete capability, then you would give them modify delete permission. Full permission, of course, gives them just that. They're able to do all of these things above, and there are no restrictions on what they can certainly do. Let's go back over to our access and figure out how we change these. So this permission here, as I mentioned before, is in regards to the investigator's own billing and expenses. If you want to change their access, just click on it and you can go and change that from the drop down. As you'll see here, not all of these permissions that we talked about earlier are available. It's just because they don't apply to this particular section. In this situation, they are all available, but you won't see these sometimes because they just don't apply to that particular permission. A perfect example of what I just described is the case detail screen. You'll give the investigator 3 permissions when it comes to the case detail screen. You either want them to have no access, to be able to view it, or to have full access. In this situation, modify and modify delete or create only just simply don't apply. Once you pick the setting permission that you would like for that particular item, click the check mark and that will be changed. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you do change permissions for a user, it may take up to 15 minutes for that to take effect. And what you want to do is ensure that that user logs out of the system and logs back in. I'm going to go over another one. This investigator, when it comes to email, I want them to be able to have no access to emails that are created or associated with administrative users. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to click no access. I also want them to be able to only see photos that they upload. I'm going to go here, choose the own line, and I want to give them view access. I don't want them to be able to delete photos. So for admins as well, I'm just going to give them view access for all of these items. I'll go over one more here in regards to case notes. If you want an investigator to not be able to see notes that are entered by a client, you can click on the client case note and provide no access to that investigator. If you want them to only be able to view notes that were entered by an admin, click that, view. Let's say we want them to have full access to their notes and the notes of other investigators. We would leave those both at full. So just to recap, the investigator roles and permissions, we clicked on settings. Then we chose roles and access for users and security. If we want to add roles for investigators, we can do that by clicking on this green plus sign here in this middle section. Here's a list of roles that you can assign to investigators in their profiles. And we want to go over one more thing here. In the investigator's profile, we're going to click on investigators. We're going to view the investigator list. We're going to pull up an investigator's profile. Down here at the bottom of the investigator's profile, you'll see we have the roles field. And you can select from those roles that we have added in our settings screen. With any investigator role, you can edit the name by clicking the edit icon. Click the middle icon to manage the role access, and click the trash can icon to delete